Dear listeners, I have so much to tell you, and I often don't know where to start. It seems the world doesn't want to admit that sometimes we make mistakes, and that sometimes the wrong person gets punished for something they didn't do. Not all of us have been personally affected, but many of us have been impacted by this reality, and I feel like it's my responsibility to share these stories with you and to tell you what I've learned about wrongful convictions. Welcome back to Wrongfully Yours. As we reach this point in our journey, again, I feel like it's necessary and the right time to pause, just for a moment, and to reflect on where we've been. The conversations we've shared so far have challenged us, they've moved us, and they've asked us to reconsider what it really means to seek justice in a system that so often falls devastatingly short. Over the past months, we've had the privilege of hearing from exonerees, psychologists, advocates, and family members of the wrongfully convicted. These guests have brought not only their expertise and insight, but also their vulnerability, their honesty, and their deep humanity. Their voices have helped us understand that wrongful convictions aren't isolated mistakes. They're systemic failures with lasting, often invisible consequences. We've learned how a single injustice can ripple outward, affecting not just the person behind bars, but their children, parents, partners, and even the entire community. We've heard about the psychological toll of being disbelieved, the bureaucracy that often resists accountability, and the quiet strength it takes to survive what should never have happened in the first place. Today, I want to revisit some of the moments that have stayed with me, the ones that taught me something new or unsettled me in the best possible way. I want to reflect on what these stories have revealed and why they matter, not just to the people who lived them, but to all of us who believe that justice should be more than a word we say in courtrooms. Whether you've been with us from the beginning or you're just tuning in now, this is a chance to take a step back and to see the bigger picture. Because the individual stories we've heard aren't just heartbreaking anecdotes, they're evidence of deeper patterns, of entrenched assumptions, and of the urgent need for change. So today's episode is about making space. Space to reflect, space to reconnect with the purpose of this podcast, and space to ask ourselves once again, what does justice require of us? How do we respond, not just with sympathy, but with action? What does it mean to be accountable, not only for the harm that's been done, but for the possibilities we still have to shape a better future? As always, I'm grateful that you're here. I know that these conversations aren't easy, but I also know that they're necessary. And the fact that you've chosen to listen, to think deeply, and to stay open matters in the most important way. So let's take a breath together, and then let's look back so we can move forward with even more clarity, compassion, and purpose. And with that, I now want to take a moment to acknowledge the contributions that each of our remarkable guests have made to Wrongfully Yours over the past few months. Our first guest of the year, John Edwards of the Ohio 4, candidly shared his story of being wrongfully incarcerated for the past 32 years for a crime that he insists he did not commit. The conversation with John confronted us with one of the most troubling realities of wrongful conviction cases: how little evidence it can take to permanently alter a person's life, and how much evidence it can take to correct past decisions. This conversation didn't raise ambiguity. It highlighted absences. There was no physical evidence, no forensic link, no confession. The only thing present was the testimony of a paid informant who changed the story every time he was asked. An informant who later recanted without incentive and whose credibility collapsed under scrutiny. What really stands out from this case is how clearly it reveals the tension between truth and finality. Once a narrative has been accepted, once certain people have been labeled as the kind of people who could have done this heinous act, the system seems more invested in preserving that story than in examining whether it was ever true. Evidence becomes secondary. Recantations become inconvenient. Accountability becomes political. This conversation also reminds us that wrongful convictions are rarely the result of a single failure. They're built through accumulation, assumptions about character, reliance on incentivized testimony, resistance to admitting error, and a legal culture that treats revisiting past convictions as a threat rather than as a responsibility. And in the middle of all this are human beings who are aging in prison, watching decades pass, continuing to fight simply because there is no other option. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share this story, not because it offers easy answers, but because it forces us to sit with hard truths about credibility, about power, and about how justice systems can continue to operate even when the truth is plainly in front of them. A truth that remains unacknowledged, unresolved, and waiting. Adding to our look at the Ohio 4 case, Dr. Akua Jackson joined us to offer another perspective about this case and about wrongful convictions generally. I have to say that my conversation with Dr. Jackson stayed with me long after we stopped recording. What struck me most was how clearly she articulated the moment when professional distance collapses and the justice system becomes personal. As a forensic psychologist, she had already seen the machinery of the courts up close, but it was watching her own brother be wrongfully convicted that transformed her understanding entirely. This conversation forced me to consider again how deeply entrenched the system's failures are, how finality, ego, and politics so often outweigh the truth, and how devastating that becomes for families who still believe, at least at first, that justice will work itself out. Dr. Jackson's perspective underscored one of the most consistent themes of this podcast. Wrongful convictions are not abstract problems or rare anomalies. They are lived realities that ripple outward, harming not only the innocent, but the victims' families, entire communities, and public trust itself. Her insistence that this could happen to anyone and her refusal to turn away from that truth was sobering, and it reminded me why these conversations matter. Gia Rizvi brought a voice to this podcast that insisted that we not only look at the courtroom, but that we also look at the community. Her conversation challenged us to think about wrongful convictions not just as legal failures, but as larger failures. Failures of the stories we tell, the assumptions we inherit, and the ways in which entire communities are conditioned to equate guilt with when someone is arrested or to think someone is innocent when they remain silent. Gia reminded us that wrongful convictions don't begin with a bad trial or a coerced confession. They begin long before that, in classrooms that don't teach legal literacy, in media portrayals that perpetrate sensationalized headlines, and in social systems that make some people more believable than others, even before they've had the chance to speak. What was especially powerful in our conversation was her insistence that it's not enough to exonerate the wrongfully convicted if we continue to uphold the very same logic that made their conviction possible in the first place. The real work lies in unlearning the myths of objectivity, neutrality, and legal infallibility that we've been taught to accept. I'm deeply thankful for Gia's contribution to this podcast. Her clarity, her compassion, and her critical insight helped us situate wrongful convictions not just as legal errors, but as public failures of empathy, imagination, and responsibility. And in doing so, she reminded us that real justice isn't delivered by verdicts alone. It's built through education and community and through the ongoing, unfinished work of truth-telling. Next, Dr. Jan Canty offered something deeply necessary, an exploration of what it means to endure secondary trauma. As someone who lost a loved one to homicide, her willingness to speak out about justice, grief, and the limitations of the adversarial system was brave, moving, and deeply instructive. What Dr. Canty offers, courageously and generously, is the perspective of a homicide survivor who understands the emotional pressure for retribution, but who also sees the need for justice to be rooted in truth and care, not in rage or revenge. Her appearance on this podcast was a profound reminder that the conversation around wrongful convictions has to include survivors, not as symbols of anger, but as partners in truth seeking. Her courage lies not just in surviving profound loss, but in using that loss to advocate for a system that acknowledges both harm and humanity, one that is capable of holding space for victims, for the wrongfully convicted, and for the long and painful work of healing. And in doing so, she reminds us that sometimes justice is about compassion, not just punishment. And we have to be ever mindful not to confuse the two, because a wrongful conviction is the worst possible outcome the justice system can produce, because it's a failure so profound that it punishes the innocent, lets the guilty go free, and erodes the very principles the system was built to uphold. I am deeply grateful to Dr. Canty for sharing her story, her insights, and her unshakable belief that we don't have to choose between justice for victims and justice for the accused. We need both, and we cannot build either without listening to voices like hers. We were then fortunate enough to host Ron Dalton, who shared his personal tragedy with us by reliving the loss of his wife, his family, and his freedom. Ron's voice carries the weight of lived experience, but he also has a rare ability to reflect on that experience in a way that teaches, challenges, and humanizes. In revisiting the events that led to his wrongful conviction, the tragic loss of his wife, the flawed forensic evidence, and the years he spent fighting to clear his name, Ron didn't just recount what happened. He helped us understand how it happened. His story reveals how inexperience, bias, and tunnel vision can collide with devastating consequences, and how a system that's slow to admit mistakes can cost people not just time, but trust, dignity, and years with their families. Ron also reminds us that wrongful convictions don't end with an acquittal. The impacts are deep and enduring, not just for the person wrongfully imprisoned, but for everyone who loves them. And yet, despite what he's endured, Ron continues to lead with integrity and purpose. As co-president of Innocence Canada, he remains deeply committed to supporting others who have been wrongfully convicted and to improving the system that failed him. His conversation offers us something rare, a first-hand account that is both deeply personal and unflinchingly systemic. It asks us to stay uncomfortable, to resist the urge to look away, and to keep working towards a justice system that values truth over finality. Thank you, Ron, for trusting us with your story and for reminding us what resilience and advocacy can look like after the unimaginable. Following Ron's conversation, Linda Gallant joined us, and she offered us a look at Ron's wrongful conviction from a different angle. And I am so grateful to her for stepping into this conversation because it's one that few people are ever asked to or able to have. And we're so fortunate to have had the opportunity to hear her recall these events with such depth, compassion, and clarity. As Ron Dalton's sister, Linda's story reminds us that wrongful convictions are never experienced in isolation. Her reflections on what it meant to become a second mother to 3 grieving children, to juggle court hearings while managing a household, and to carry hope throughout more than a decade of legal uncertainty, offer a profoundly important perspective, the perspective of family. Linda helps us understand how wrongful convictions reshape lives in quiet, invisible ways. Her conversation reminds us that behind every exoneree is often a network of people who also lost years, who carried enormous emotional and financial burdens, and who bore the weight of stigma, confusion, and grief while still trying to hold their families together. What Linda brings to this conversation is not just a timeline of events, but a powerful narrative about love, loyalty, and resilience. She shows us what it means to show up for someone when the world is walking away and what kind of strength it takes to keep going when the system keeps falling short. Her voice is a crucial part of the story, and her courage in telling it helps expand the way we talk about justice, not just as a legal outcome, but as a human experience that ripples far beyond the courtroom. So thank you, Linda, for sharing your story and for reminding us that the impact of wrongful convictions stretches into living rooms and schoolyards and everyday moments that we too often take for granted. Following Linda, Monique Steele joined us to share with us that when she was just 13 years old, Ron Dalton, who was a close family friend, was wrongfully convicted. She wasn't in the courtroom. She wasn't giving media interviews or attending legal meetings. But like so many others who live in the periphery of a wrongful conviction, she absorbed the confusion, the silence, and the undercurrents of pain that surrounded the people she loved. And she never forgot. Monique's voice invites us to consider a different kind of impact. The kind that seeps in quietly through family dinners, hushed conversations, and the subtle ways that children come to understand the world around them. Her reflections illuminate what it means to grow up adjacent to injustice and how those early impressions shape a person's understanding of judgment, empathy, and human complexity. What Monique offers is not only a powerful testament to the ripple effects of wrongful convictions, but it's also a call to listen more closely to those whose lives have been shaped by the cases in indirect, deeply formative ways. She reminds us that wrongful convictions don't just harm the person behind bars. They reach into homes, shape childhoods, and live on in the perspectives of those who bore witness quietly and carried those lessons into adulthood. As someone who witnessed the ripple effects of Ron Dalton's wrongful conviction from the perspective of a young family friend, Monique brings a rare and important lens. It's one that reminds us how far the impact of a miscarriage of justice can reach. So thank you, Monique, for your courage, your honesty, and for helping us see the wider circle of harm and the humanity that so often goes unnoticed. Yours is a story that is rarely told, but it is so incredibly important to share, and I am ever grateful to have had the chance to share it with you. So, as we reflect on the first stretch of the year, I'm struck by the depth and the range of perspectives that have shaped these episodes. Each guest brought something essential, something that only they could offer. Their stories, insights, and critiques have created a layered and often challenging portrait of how wrongful convictions unfold and what it takes to confront them. To all of my guests, I cannot thank you enough. Your honesty, courage, and clarity makes this podcast what it is. You've invited us not just to listen, but to learn and to sit with the discomfort of truths that we can't ignore. What emerges across these conversations is a sobering thorough line. Wrongful convictions aren't rare, and they're not accidents. They're symptoms of deeper, systemic failings. Failings in how we define credibility, how we assign blame, and how we interpret evidence. We've heard about missed red flags, misplaced trust, and courtroom decisions that defy common sense. But we've also heard about persistence, about community, about the quiet determination it takes to challenge a system that so often resists correction. These conversations matter because they don't just expose what's broken. They point us towards what's possible when we really listen, when we make space for that lived experience, when we remember that justice isn't automatic, it's something we have to build together. And so once again, I'm at the point that I have to ask, where do we go from here? These first episodes of the year have laid a powerful foundation. It's one that's built on honesty, lived experience, and a willingness to look closely at what the justice system gets wrong too frequently. We've heard about the personal toll of wrongful convictions, the systemic patterns that allow them to happen, and the quiet strength of those who continue to speak out. In the episodes ahead, we'll keep asking difficult questions. We'll examine how wrongful convictions are made possible, not just by legal errors, but by deeply rooted assumptions about truth and guilt and authority. We'll look at how these cases move or stall through the system, and we'll listen to the voices of those working to create something better. We'll continue to speak with exonerees and lawyers and scholars and police officers and family members and advocates and really anyone who has a story to tell, not because they have all the answers, but because they've lived through the questions and are still asking them. And we'll return again and again to the idea that justice isn't just about correcting mistakes after they happen. It's about asking how we can prevent them in the first place. These aren't abstract concerns. They're urgent, practical, and deeply human. And while the road ahead is complicated, I honestly believe the conversations we're having together in this space are helping to move us in the right direction. So whether you're inside the justice system or affected by it, studying it, or simply curious about it, I hope you'll stay with us. This work doesn't belong to any one group. It belongs to all of us. And the more voices we bring to the table, the stronger the conversation becomes. So before I sign off, I want to return to the heart of why we're here. Talking about wrongful convictions isn't just about recounting legal missteps or pointing to systemic failures. It's about acknowledging that these aren't abstract problems. They're lived realities. They leave scars that reach far beyond the courtroom. When someone is wrongfully convicted, the harm ripples outward. Families are torn apart. Communities are shaken. Children grow up without parents. And the public's trust in justice is eroded. Every wrongful conviction should call into question how we assign guilt, how we interpret truth, and how power operates within our legal institutions. These are not comfortable truths, but they are necessary ones to question. That's why what we're doing here isn't just storytelling, it's truth-telling. And truth-telling demands something from all of us. For those who share their stories, it requires an extraordinary vulnerability. For those of us listening, it requires a real openness and a willingness to stay present, even when the details are hard to hear. It means resisting simple answers, and it means sitting with hard, complicated realities. We often talk about resilience when we speak of exonerees, and for good reason. It's true. They are resilient in ways that deserve to be recognized. But I also want to pause and name the undeniable injustice that exists in needing that kind of resilience in the first place. No one should have to spend years fighting to prove what should have been clear all along. And no one should have to fight that hard to be seen by a system that was supposed to protect them. And yet they do. And they show up in courtrooms, in classrooms, in public forums, and here on this podcast. They share their stories not because they owe their stories to us, but because they believe in the possibility of something better. And that is what stays with me the most from these conversations. The deep, persistent belief that change is possible. But we also have to know that it is not inevitable. Real change only happens when we're willing to examine the systems we take for granted and to truly listen to the people those systems have harmed. And I'd like to think that this podcast is one small part of that process. It's a refusal to look away. It's a space where pain is named and injustice is exposed. But it's also a space where hope can take root, where accountability begins, where healing might grow, albeit slowly and carefully. So as we continue, I hope you'll stay with us. Let this be more than just an episode you play and forget. Let it be a moment that stays with you. Ask yourself, what role do I play? What can I learn? What can I do? I hope you'll carry these stories with you. Let them unsettle you. Let them challenge what you thought you knew. And let them be the starting point for the kind of reflection and action that real change requires. Because confronting wrongful convictions doesn't happen in a one-time moment of truth. It's a journey. It's a process of listening and learning and refusing to look away. So thank you all for being here, for choosing to listen, even when it's uncomfortable, and for believing, as I do, that justice isn't just about fixing the past. It's about shaping a better future, one conversation at a time, because justice must be pursued not just in the courts, but in our conversations, in our communities, and in the choices we make every day. Because every story shared, every voice heard, and every mind that is opened brings us one step closer to a more just and compassionate world. So together, let's keep asking hard questions, amplifying unheard voices, and working toward a system that reflects the values we all deserve. Values like fairness, accountability, and truth. These are values that we should never have to question. They should be a given. And so it's on all of us to make that a reality. And while today's letter may have piqued your interest, this is only part of the story. There's still so much more to tell. The effects of wrongful convictions are far-reaching. They touch us all. I'll write to you again soon as I continue my conversations with those whose lives have been impacted by a wrongful conviction. But until then, I remain wrongfully yours. And if today's episode resonated with you, please consider sharing it with others, liking and following the podcast on your favorite platforms so you don't miss what comes next. And as always, thank you for listening to Wrongfully Yours, where we believe that telling these stories is the first step towards preventing the next injustice. And until next time, stay curious, stay hopeful, and keep fighting for justice. If you have something that you want to talk about with me, or even if you want to just send me some words of encouragement, you can drop me a line at wrongfullyyourspodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out my website, kellylozon.ca, for more information about me and the kinds of things that I do.